So I'm a little late to this topic, and the reason is because I initially wasn't planning on making a video discussing this topic. I was just going to save my thoughts for when I actually got the Death Star and reviewed it. However, even after over 2 weeks, it's still causing so much commotion and discussion within the community that I thought at this point I might as well pitch in and give my own thoughts on this subject. So basically, if you don't know, the Death Star got revealed a few weeks ago at the beginning of this month, September, and along with the reveal of the set, there were a handful of designer interviews that were held by LAN members. And they have caused a ton of controversy and kind of actually even added more backlash to this set. And the main one I'm going to be focusing on in this video is the one that Solid Brick Studios put out, and also briefly on the Brickset interview as well. But the Solid Brick Studios interview starts off with Cesar Soares, who is the main designer of this Death Star. Obviously, multiple designers pitched in different things on this set, but he is the main one. He is the one who built this entire model and called the shots for everything that's included in it. And this part of the interview, for the most part, is actually pretty enjoyable, and most of it makes a lot of sense. It's really cool hearing his thought process behind the set. He explains why they chose this slice design style, saying that they basically wanted to have the entire interior of the Death Star visible all at once. And he was also really big on making the set have a small footprint so fans with not a lot of room could display it pretty easily. However, I want to talk about the idea of prioritizing the interior and making it all visible at one glance. The previous two Death Stars also prioritized the interior. However, obviously they were a sphere, so it wasn't all at one glance. You had to kind of move the model around to see every room within the build. And personally, I've always thought those sets were ugly. I'm gonna be honest, I've never liked the design of them. I think they're unappealing. I think they're just a big jumble of bricks, to be honest. And this one right here is showing off the interior a lot better, meaning that, in my opinion, yes, I think this design of the Death Star is leagues better than the previous two. However, I don't think it's better than the 2005 model. But basically, they wanted to prioritize the interior, which is a valid statement for this design choice. But like I just mentioned, the previous two Death Stars, which were the only ones available for over 10 years, also did this. Obviously not to this degree, but they still were designed to prioritize the interior of the Death Star. So that just brings up the question as to why was prioritizing the interior even a decision in the first place? We already had two Death Stars with this as a priority. Why did we need a third one? Now, mind you, again, the third one is a lot better than those two, but like, why did we need another Death Star prioritizing the interior? We already had that 2 times and for over 10 years. So in my opinion, this was just not a good idea to begin with. The design choice is cool and looks good, but they already made Death Stars prioritizing the interior. Why couldn't they make one prioritizing the exterior? They only did that once back in 2005. So I just think that decision in the first place was kind of ridiculous. He then goes on talking about how much smaller the model would have to be if it actually was a sphere, which is obvious. There's no way they could make a spherical Death Star at this size. It would be significantly smaller. I imagine a $1,000 spherical Death Star with an interior would be about the same size as the 2005 model, maybe slightly larger, and obviously have a full interior and not be hollow. And obviously, I think it's safe to say that fans would be a lot more happier with that option than they are with this option. I think a 2005 size Death Star, or maybe slightly larger with an accessible interior, is way more appealing for $1,000 than this is for $1,000. He also briefly mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, and that is a packaging capacity. He basically said that not only would a spherical Death Star at this size be significantly more expensive, it would also overreach their packaging capacity, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, with these Lego boxes, after all, they are just cardboard, so there's definitely a limit on how big they can be and how much weight of pieces they can hold on the inside. And I'd say with sets this large, around the 10,000 piece mark is about as big as they can go. And the reason I'm noting this is because I've seen a lot of people complaining online saying that, oh, since Lego is making a $1,000 set, they're going to make a $1,500 set in no time. They're just going to keep on making bigger sets and raising the price nonstop. And basically what he mentioned about the packaging capacity just completely disproves this. I think this set right here opens the door for sets being $1,000, but it definitely does not open the doors for sets being more than $1,000. If this set ends up selling well, I definitely wouldn't be surprised if there's more $1,000 sets in the future. But people trying to claim that Lego is going to make $1,500 sets and $1,600 sets, that's just completely ridiculous, because they would just have a hard time putting $1,500 worth of Lego pieces inside these thin cardboard boxes. And also they got to think about things like convenience for the person that's buying this set. Like, this Death Star is already pushing 50 pounds. Imagine a set that's 50% heavier. I mean, can you imagine going to the Lego store in some big mall and having to carry out a 70 or 80 pound Lego set all the way through the mall and all the way back to your car in the parking lot? It's just little things like that that kind of say, you know, sets most likely aren't going to get bigger than this. And they're also most likely not going to be more expensive than $1,000 until, you know, inflation does its thing. And that's going to be a long time. So in my opinion, I don't think we're going to see sets that are more expensive than $1,000 for at least least a decade. Again, there might be other sets that reach the $1,000 threshold, but I doubt there are going to be any that surpass it. But like I mentioned, Caesar's part of the interview is actually pretty enjoyable, and most of the stuff he says is valid. However, there are a few things that I wasn't really a big fan of. One is that he claims that this necessarily wasn't intended to be the first $1,000 set, and that he just started with the sketch that someone else drew, and his model just ended up being a $1,000 size set. And I personally just do not believe this at all. Ever since the Millennium Falcon released for $800 back in 2017, we knew a $1,000 Lego set was on the horizon, and it just makes perfect sense for the first $1,000 set to be the Death Star. I mean, I think that's been Lego's intention for a long time. They knew they were going to make a $1,000 set at some point, and the Death Star was probably their main choice. So for him to be like, oh, this wasn't intended to be a $1,000 set, it just ended up that way when I designed it, I just don't believe that at all. He then discusses the GWP being the TIE Fighter, and he said that the TIE Fighter was the obvious choice for a vehicle included with the set, except he personally pushed really hard for the Imperial Shuttle because he thought that would work better, and that's what they ended up going with as the vehicle with the set. And then he said once they finished the model and put the shuttle on the inside, they realized that there was still room in the hangar for another vehicle, which the obvious choice would be a TIE Fighter. And he said, and I quote, "Why don't we just make the TIE Fighter the GWP?" Which is honestly just insane to me. Instead of let's make it a GWP, it should have been let's include it in the set too. That honestly just seems kind of scummy to me in my opinion, and also very low effort, because it shows that they kind of just came up with the GWP for a $1,000 set last minute. Now I am saying this knowing that this most likely was not their decision as in the designers, the Caesar guy, this most likely wasn't his decision, because he was given limits from the higher ups in Lego, and including the shuttle in the set most likely met those limits, and including the TIE Fighter and the shuttle most likely would have exceeded those limits. And when I say limits, it's mainly the budget they're trying to stick to, but I'll talk about that more later. But anyways, this decision to include both these vehicles most likely wasn't up to the designers. However, that doesn't mean there wasn't someone somewhere in the level of ranks at Lego that could have made this decision to include it in the set and make the GWP something else, but they didn't do that. They just went with the idea of this last minute GWP being some crappy TIE Fighter that should have been with the Death Star. It just tells me that Lego is being very, very greedy with their profit margins, even for a set that retails for $1,000. However, the idea of Lego being greedy with their profit margins gets even worse when it gets to the portion of the interview with the minifigure and graphic designer, Matty O'Neill. And this guy right here is actually where my main criticism for these interviews comes from. Like I briefly mentioned, the portion with Caesar had a few things that I thought, were suspicious, but for the most part, it was pretty enjoyable, and a lot of what he said, not all, but a lot of it made sense. But that's not really the case with this guy right here, the graphic designer. And the very first question he's asked is the lack of dual molded legs with these Imperial officers. And then he responds by really diving into the topic of their restrictions and the amount of quote-unquote frames they are given to include new elements. And like I mentioned with the GWP, this is also, for the most part, true. I mean, there definitely are higher ups in Lego that are above these designers and give them budgets and give them the profit margins they gotta stick to. So yes, they are actually limited with what they can do. And I'll go more in depth on that here in a minute, but for the most part, it's mainly not these designers' fault. However, I do think this minifigure guy right here poorly ranked his priorities within his given limitations. For example, he said that instead of giving the Imperial officers dual molded legs, he wanted to include multiple new characters that they had never made before, like the Imperial Dignitary, Galen Erso, the Hot Tub Stormtrooper, which is valid. I mean, new characters like that are awesome. However, at the same time, there's also quite a few unnecessary things they did with these minifigures that could have went somewhere else. Like for example, they're including a completely new, redesigned Farm Boy Luke minifigure, when instead they could have just easily included the same one that they released back in 2022, and the frame, quote unquote, as he put it, for this new Luke Skywalker could have been put to giving one of the Imperial officers dual molded legs. But no, instead of doing that, we're getting a brand new Farm Boy Luke minifigure, when I'm pretty sure almost everyone would rather have a dual molded legged Imperial officer. And then it gets even worse with the face prints on the Stormtroopers. Every single Stormtrooper included in this set has a different face print, and some of them are actually new face prints. Like, why in the world are we prioritizing these Stormtrooper head prints that are going to be covered up by the helmets over dual molded legs on the Imperial officers? That is just so insane to me. Like, yes, this dude is given limitations, but he is just not making good decisions with the limitations he's given. I mean, if all these Stormtroopers here had the same face print, that would give more than enough, again, quote unquote frames as he put it, to these Imperial officers having dual molded legs. But then it actually goes downhill even further when he gets asked about the dual molded leg C-3PO. And this actually doesn't come from Solid Brick Studios interview, this actually comes from the Brickset interview, and it says, "I assume the same applies to C-3PO, but one of the problems I struggle with is that you already manufacture the same minifigure with a dual molded leg, so why not drop the simpler version and just make that one? This happened with Darth Vader receiving arm printing a few years ago, which then became the standard. And then he says there are different factors with every set, but the same actually happened with C-3PO and R2-D2 at their 75339 Death Star trash compactor diorama. We added printed arms to C-3PO and decoration on R2's back for the diorama, which became the norm going forward and still is today. Dual molding is a bit different though. Adding the cost to a figure that might need to appear in a much smaller and cheaper set like C-3PO is not necessarily an option. So in his case, we cannot commit the dual molded leg becoming the standard design. And to be honest, in my opinion, this question and the response given to the question are both ridiculous, because the way this question should have been framed was kind of butchered. I don't think he should have brought up a dual molded leg C-3PO being the standard going forward, because that then opened the door for the designer to talk about how, you know, it can't be the standard because it's too expensive to include in a smaller set. So the interviewer bringing up the idea of it being the standard basically gave the designer a scapegoat, because I don't think anybody really cares about a dual molded leg C-3PO being the standard. I mean, if they release a $25 Luke's Landspeeder next year and there's not a dual molded leg C-3PO in that set, I don't think anyone's gonna care. It's the fact that this is a $1,000 set, the most expensive set of all time, and it doesn't have a dual molded leg C-3PO that is already in production with the buildable C-3PO from last year. It's frustrating that like the questions we want to ask are like sort of getting asked, but not in the right way, because again, it's asked in a way that's open-ended to where he could talk about dual molded leg C-3PO being in cheaper sets when we don't care about that. We care about it being in a $1,000 set. But no, the way this question was framed kind of gave Maddie, the designer here, a scapegoat, and not even acknowledge the fact that this isn't a cheap set. It's the most expensive set of all time, and they're not including a dual molded leg C-3PO in that. So most of the stuff that I just mentioned about what he's prioritizing, like giving the stormtroopers new face prints instead of the officers dual molded legs and then C-3PO, that stuff mainly is this guy's fault for just having bad priorities. However, this guy is not the ultimate problem. The ultimate problem is the higher ups at LEGO that is giving this guy his limitations, because they're obviously just giving these dudes budgets that are trying to stay very, very strict to certain profit margins, which for a set of this size and this price point should be very lenient. Now, LEGO doesn't disclose what their profit margins are, so nobody really knows an exact number. However, the estimate that's usually thrown around is about 25 to 30%. And since this is a very large set and it's also a licensed set, I'm just going to go on the lower end and say that LEGO has a 25% profit margin on this Death Star. I know that could potentially be way, way off, but I'm just going with the very limited information that I can find. So that means that with a theoretical 25% profit margin, LEGO is making $250 off of every sale with this Death Star. And again, that's most likely not their profit margin with this set. It could be higher or lower, but at the very least, we do know they are making hundreds of dollars off of every sale of this Death Star, which is more than enough profit margin to tank the extra expenses of making these figures the highest quality possible, meaning that whoever is giving the designers these limitations is being overly greedy with the profit margin on this set. Like if you're making $200 to $250 off of every sale on this set, obviously that is a high enough profit margin to tank whatever the freaking cost would be to get these guys dual molded legs, which I imagine is literally like $5 to $10 at the most. So yeah, again, this minifigure designer guy really isn't making good decisions with the limitations he's given, but the people in the financial departments and higher ups at LEGO that are giving out the limitations and giving out the budgets for sets of this size are being overly greedy, and it's ridiculous. So yeah, that's basically all I have to say regarding these interviews with the LEGO Death Star design team, which you know most likely aren't even real interviews in the first place. All of these questions are probably screened, and all these answers and responses to these screened questions are probably scripted before the interview starts recording. But still, I mean, I thought it was worth it to make a video on it. And also, this video I'm making right now is no hate towards Brickset, and also no hate at all towards Solid Brick Studios. It's mainly just criticism to LEGO and these designers' choices. Anyways though, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. If you're new, please consider subscribing, and if you want to check out more videos, you see on the screen right now.